So, hi, Alex.
Hello.
Thank you for joining the series with the Ask for understanding more about your business and why you do what you do. So, could you begin with a brief introduction on you and what it is that you do?
Sure. Well, I set up a consultancy, that's a grandiose word because it's just me, called Basic Arts. And what I do is I essentially advise businesses on their strategy, what direction they should take in the market and how they can sort of carve out, owned, defensible, non-competitive space in whatever category they're in. And it's worth pointing out, I suppose, the word strategy is a very sort of flabby kind of word that means all sorts of things. So in this case, we're talking about, the direction for the whole company, which will define simultaneously the brand, the product, the distribution, everything, and how you join that all up and make it aligned and coherent.
Great. And how do businesses decide that they need to work with you? What would be the moment at which they go, oh, Alex is the guy for us?
Oh, well, I think that there's the most common occurrence, which wouldn't be the only one, but it's the one that definitely crops up the most regularly, is probably when businesses have achieved a good degree of sort of initial growth, let's say in the first 5 or 6 years of their life. It could be longer, could be shorter, but when they really have traction, they had that initial idea, they put it out there and it's somehow taken off. And then in those situations, what is normally the case is that although they're doing pretty well, they probably won't really quite know why, and things will have gone in a very different direction than what they perhaps initially anticipated. So, they have something good on their hands, but they aren't necessarily fully sure of in what way things are working. And so there comes a point then where you want to sort of move from being in a sort of experimental phase, which I think is how all businesses begin. They all have to begin in a sort of experimental phase. And actually, we'll talk about this exact issue, I think. And then there comes a point where they've gathered enough information about themselves as they can stop, consolidate their learnings, and then think, okay, well, what we're actually really doing here, what we're really all about is X. And from that point, you can start sort of doing it deliberately and off you go. So yeah, I do think it's that moment when a business has sort of proven itself, but they still don't quite know what they're doing or where they're going in the long term. That is the real sweet spot. Sometimes it can be early stage businesses. Sometimes it can be businesses which are, 20, 30 years old, because the truth is that most businesses, they never actually develop a fully coherent strategy. You can become very successful and very big with no good strategic thinking at all. In fact, I would say that is the norm. So yeah, there's a bit of a mixed bag.
So we're going to turn the lens on you now and your own strategic kind of goals and what you've set out to do rather than what you've been doing with your clients. Although there's obviously context of why you do what you do is those businesses and their needs. But talk us through how you arrived, first of all, on that as your why. Why do you do the work that you do? And then we'll talk a little bit about how where that might have evolved as you've gathered your own kind of data points and after your own experimentation early days. So yeah, talk us through the early days of that.
Sure. Well, the original idea was I was a strategy director in a marketing agency, and obviously, as you can imagine, the job of agencies like that is basically to put sort of lipstick on the pig, right? So a business will come to you. Oh, sorry, I'm just being delivered a tea here. Thank you very much. My secretary. So yeah, the business will come to the agency and they'll say, okay, here we are, here's what we do. Your job is to somehow make people understand this and make us look good. And that's basically what a creative agency will do. They'll basically find what are, for the most part, sort of tricks in order to kind of present a business which is probably a bit generic or boring or confusing or whatever in a light which makes people want to buy it. And to a degree, there's sort of smoke and mirrors there. And that's the fun, really, of working in an agency, finding clever, insightful, creative ways to sell something which can't really sell itself. And now, what I noticed through that is that every so often, maybe like, 5% of clients, something like that, you get a business that come along, which is actually just so sort of intrinsically interesting, has a strong position in its market, charismatic, coherent, whatever you want to call it, does something very valuable and good, that you don't basically need to actually use any sort of trickery or creativity to sell it. It sort of sells itself. It's intrinsically good. And in that scenario, the agency becomes a bit more of like a messenger boy, I would say, just there for execution and nothing else, because all the thinking has kind of been done within the business itself. And so although that's a much less interesting type of business to work with as an agency, of course, if you're sitting on the client side of the table, well, that's the kind of business you want to run, right? So I sort of thought initially, well, it would be much more interesting to help businesses become like that type of business, to sort of work on the pig, so to speak, than to continue sort of putting lipstick on it. Obviously, that's always going to be an important part of the process, what creative agencies can do, but it's fundamentally pretty unimportant compared to the more fundamental questions of what exactly does this business do, and is it something which is inherently worthwhile? So that was kind of my thinking. And to the question of a sort of why, I did think at the time, sort of like a lot of people do, I want to have this sort of bigger sort of mission behind this. And one thing that was quite central to what I wanted to do is I was quite committed to this idea that if a business does interesting things in terms of the way it operates, the way it delivers its product, etc., the business will sort of become its own ad. So to give you a very basic example of the principle, if we think about, let's say, Patagonia, and the fact that Patagonia have unlimited repairs for free on all their products, that's an embedded characteristic of the business. But because it's quite interesting and quite creative, it sort of does the same job as an ad might do, because it's a talkable fact. Most businesses, they have interesting ads, but the actual business itself is quite dull. But some businesses like that, the actual business itself is as interesting as an ad. And the line that I used at the time was, make interesting companies, not interesting advertising. And I really thought in the big picture that this might result in theory, this could result in, if you imagine all of that money being spent on ads and media spend, I think I had the figure, I can't remotely remember what it was, but obviously it's billions and billions each year. If that wasn't spent essentially on noise, but was actually turned back in on the businesses themselves, and the businesses used it to kind of make themselves intrinsically more interesting in the direction of whatever their strategy was, then you'd create this sort of explosion of new value, because of course the businesses would, for the most part, be doing sort of practical, useful, interesting things. And so you're sort of taking all of that, in a sense, quote unquote, useless advertising spend, and you're turning it into useful business development spend, which is also doing the same job that the advertising spend used to do. So there was a sort of like big kind of sort of grandiose idea I had. And of course, I didn't really think that, such a change would ever happen, but I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about. The thing is, though, over time and sort of practicing what I preach, you find that your initial prototype idea is, as far as I'm concerned, the prototype idea of every business, mine included, is fundamentally pretty stupid and it doesn't work, but you just need something to get you in the game. But then, the way that evolves over time, 2 years later, you'll look and you'll find that you've created something very different than what you intended to create. And so in my case, it was certainly, I wouldn't say it was very different, but it was different enough as that some of those initial theories kind of flew out of the window. And so I actually don't really talk or think about any of that stuff anymore, to be honest.
So let's just take stock then. So you started off in-house, you observed that your ideal client was actually doing the thing that, a business would want to do. So you kind of put that on its head and said, well, this business that's doing really well, how can we make other businesses like that? Your offering was designed to reverse engineer, so to speak, that end goal. And a big picture vision of yours would be all the advertising in the world gets rechanneled into useful tactics, and that looks like XYZ to become coherent and so on. So what were some of the signals along your way in the last or the early 2 years that showed you were not able to execute that exact vision as you set out?
So there were a couple of things. So the first thing was, this type of project is a project that can only be done at founder or CEO level, because it's a holistic thing that touches every part of the business, not just, you know, the brand or marketing department. However, by talking in the language of marketing and advertising, as I was, even though the end product wasn't strictly speaking advertising, because that was my way in, it always brought me in on a lower level. So it always brought me in at a marketing level. So let's say marketing director level. And one thing that I found, I think you can probably apply this to a lot of services for businesses actually, is that you can't swim upstream, right? You can swim downstream, you can't swim upstream. You can't come into a business at, let's say, a brand manager level and then claw your way up to having conversations with the MD, for sake of argument. It just doesn't work. And so one of them, my more sort of tactical things, was I realized, well, I need to find a way of talking about things which is speaking about them not in a marketing director's language, but in a chief executive's language or in a founder's language. So first of all, I basically had to cut all references to things like marketing, advertising, brand, because as soon as you say that, you know, you kind of slip into that mode. And I realized that really what I was selling was, like, at a more just fundamental level, strategy, and the actual overall direction of the business is obviously the responsibility of the MD. So I had to sort of completely change my language. So that kind of like damaged it. Another thing that damaged it as well is that at the beginning, I was really thinking mostly in terms of like the creative outputs of the process. So all the cool things that the business would be doing in order to kind of reposition themselves in the market. Now that's obviously really important, but actually really the thing that you have to do to get to that, the raw strategy, that's actually kind of the thing that really I'm delivering and they're buying. So, you know, I had to kind of put more of a focus on that than on the kind of the creative outputs. And so I realized, yeah, that I needed to do that kind of refocusing. And so once you refocus on the strategy and away from the more creative stuff, you know, you end up speaking a very, very different game. You know, so now to give you a sort of a comparison, whilst my sort of line in the past was make interesting companies, not interesting advertising, now I say make companies without competitors. So you can see how the focus has sort of shifted, even though arguably the actual thing that I'm doing is exactly the same. So you just have this sort of reframing of the core product that you have. And I think that this reframing process is sort of the essence of most strategic projects.
Yeah, it reminds me of that expression that they give you in sort of sales and marketing training, which is sell the transformation, not the process. And so the idea was like, you know, your process and you know what you do, what makes your work, you know, really great. But the end transformation that your customers want is to not really have competitors. They don't really care if they get there because of their advertising or their strategy or what. They just want to be the best in the world at what they do. So you sort of mentioned this, I think you used the word climbing down from your why or vision.
Mm-hmm.
Did this reframe feel like a change in tact for you, or was it just like an aha moment? Talk us through the more, I guess, emotional or inward turning moments for you as you thought about how you were going to build your business.
It probably happened sort of gently enough as that I didn't really notice it happening. But, you know, I did at some point end up reflecting that I'd sort of created something that was probably more, maybe it's not the right word, more pragmatic and less idealistic than the initial thing. You know, every business is obviously, it's a negotiation between what you want to do and what the market wants, right? And probably that first idea that people set out with is going to be much more directed in what they want to do and their sort of ultimate idealized, like, this is how this is the perfect vision of how I want things to be. Now, like I said before, that basically never works because it hasn't been sort of beaten around and stress tested by the market response. So in some sense, where you end up is always going to be a sort of a more sort of grounded and realistic thing than the first thing you created. And certainly with a lot of my clients, you know, I see that too. Most of them start out with these kind of, oh, this bloody dog. Can you hear that, or is that okay?
Yeah, I can hear it, but it's fine.
Let me just get something to do with him.
Need some
I know
attention.
what he's like. He doesn't stop. Yeah. So yeah, like I was saying, no, I think that I've seen this with a lot of my clients too. They start out with these more kind of idealistic visions, but you know, in reality, although on paper it sort of seems like a climb down, it probably isn't really, because actually you look at it another way, and what you're doing is you're evolving in the direction of what the world actually wants and needs, not your own sort of narcissistic, self-serving idea of what would look really cool to other people, you know, which is kind of how it how it begins. So yeah, it was where I've ended up is in some ways less kind of creative and sexy than where I began. But, you know, if you are sort of mindful of it and managing the process, you still, I think, end up somewhere that's a hell of a lot more interesting than 99% of other businesses.
Yeah. And another outcome of that I always think about is that you, as in one, sets out with this vision of what they'll create. And there's a sort of height of confidence in the early days because you think it's achievable. And then when you go through the curve of realizing that it's not achievable and you have to kind of eat humble pie, you are looking at people who haven't started and think, good luck. And so it's like, yes, you might not be exactly what you wanted to be doing, but you have kind of created this moat around you where you know that you had to go through the pains of building to get to where you are. And anybody coming into that space would have the same experiences, no matter what they're trying to build, as you say, just purely based on a market need. Yeah,
and that's such a good point, because there's obviously a sort of getting over the hump, and any feelings of regret you might have for quote unquote sacrificing your principles, if you think it's like that, are massively outweighed by the fact that you've basically gone through the frankly quite unpleasant sort of self-discovery process, and you've settled somewhere that works. You know, I think if I'd known how long it would take me to get to where I am now, you know, which isn't a huge amount of time, it's like 5 or 6 years or something, but I'd have never done it, because you begin, what you imagine is going to happen is so much quicker and so much more explosive and so much more spectacular. So it's probably good that you think that, because that's what makes you do it. But looking back, you're like, oh, I'm so glad I don't have to go through that all over again. Yeah, the fuel when you start off adding to the fire, you're like, look at me, well, nothing can stop me. And then, yeah, it can kind of, but as you say, you've reached a good point. It's taken you perhaps longer than you thought. But to wrap up then, I'm interested how you choose what you do and don't work on now that you've sort of identified your client base and the real work you do. Is there ever a point where you get thrown off that based on, you know, other enticing opportunities or services that come your way? Like, how do you sort of define what you do and don't take on? Well, I was lucky in this respect, because I would say that basically I earned zero money to all intents and purposes from this business for the first year. And then probably, I can't remember how much, but not a lot the second year. And I could get away with that because what I was doing was I kind of was gradually turning off my old job. So I went from 4 days a week to 3 days a week to 6 days a month or something random. And like, so I was really turning the volume down on that as I was turning the volume up on this. And so what that meant is that never once did I do something just because I wanted the money. I only wanted to do the purest articulation of what I do. And obviously, if I just quit my job wholesale and then I'd started that, then maybe it wouldn't have been the case. Maybe I would have had to have taken some sort of short-term compromises. But as it happens, I didn't. And so I've only ever, fortunately so far, done projects which are exactly the type of project that I sort of envisaged and kind of like sort of the process that I designed in my head, if you like. So obviously now there are still questions of, which particular projects, which particular clients to work with and stuff like that. However, I have found that there are a couple of sort of like slightly kind of dicey gray areas, but for the most part, I've found that it's remarkably self-selecting. I think that if you sort of touching on the why thing, I think if you create a business which is very sort of idiosyncratic and particular and has a real sort of style and vibe, if you want, for want of a better word, to it, then it's going to attract like for like. So, I very rarely do I get contacted by a prospective client who is sort of not, quote unquote, my type of brand. And when it does happen, it's very unusual that they convert. In fact, I don't know if maybe there's one or two projects I can think of that were a little bit sort of unusual for me. But basically, even though I want the I wanted the money, I tried to make them happen, but they just don't.
Yeah.
So it's all pretty natural, I think.
That's a real sign, as we kind of come full circle then, that you have managed to achieve that coherence and clarity that you look to create with your clients for your own brand, in that people seem to get what you do and want that from you rather than other things that are adjacent. So thank you for sharing. I think that pretty much concludes what we wanted to discuss today. Would you have any parting words of advice or wisdom for people who are on that path, figuring out the kind of market need versus their vision that they can look at as they go through their weeks?
I can never think of any advice that can beat the advice of Dolly Parton, who said, "Find out who you are and do it on purpose." That quote is a better piece of strategic advice than anything I've ever read in any business book or history book or whatever ever. It is spot on.
Amazing. Well, I think that's why your content always really resonates with you. I try and help people figure out who they are and what business they should build as a result of their internal strength. So thank you, Dolly, for inspiring both of our businesses. Where can people find you if they want to follow more of your work, Alex?
So my website is basicarts.org. And if you go there, I have a newsletter. If you sign up for it, to kick it off, there's a kind of 8-day mini course on strategic thinking for founders, which it's just 8 days, 8 emails. So, pretty light touch stuff. But yeah, if you sign up for that, you'll get that for free. And yeah, I think hopefully it can give you a pretty good grounding in some of these principles.
I do agree. It gave me a really good sense of what you offer, but also really helped my business. And as I said, just as you said, 8 days. So it's a good kind of sizable way to get in there. So thank you so much for your time. It's been really great.
No problems. Pleasure.